In the year 1996, a popular cheerleader from a small town disappeared. 2 weeks later, her body was found in a creek bed only 45 minutes away from where she lived. But the events that came after this unveiled a sinister conspiracy involving 3 different suspects. This is the case of Heather Rich. Hello, friend, and welcome to High Time Crime. My name's Joel, and on here I specialize in true crime and also being a master of disguise. But anyway, today we're going over a deeply unsettling case about a girl who made friends with the wrong crowd. Heather Rose Rich was born on January 19th of 1980 to her parents, Gail and Dwayne Rich. Heather had 3 brothers and was the second youngest in her family. The town she and her family lived in is called Waurika, Oklahoma. Waurika is a small town with a population of around 2,000 people. It sits on the border between Oklahoma and Texas and is a place where everyone knows everyone else. The reason why Heather's parents, Gail and Dwayne, moved there was because it reminded them of the town they grew up in another part of Oklahoma called Elgin. The Riches figured Waurika would be a safe, quiet place to raise a family, but in many ways, their decision to live here would end up being a mistake. Gail and Dwayne's only daughter, Heather, grew up to be a pretty and energetic young woman. As she entered her teen years, she became notably popular and attracted a lot of attention from boys. This attention was paid back tenfold, and as a result, Heather became increasingly self-conscious. By 8th grade, she was already purging, aka throwing up in order to stay a size 2. Additionally, she began to harm herself after her father got injured on the job and needed to be cared for. Before long, the responsibility of doing all the household chores fell exclusively on her and her siblings. At the time, the responsibility of being the sole breadwinner fell on the shoulders of her mother, Gail. Despite all the problems in her personal life, though, once Heather had moved on to high school, her popularity only grew. As a sophomore, she was a nominee for Homecoming Queen and an honors student, and voted sophomore class favorite by her peers. On top of these accolades, she was even a member of the cheerleading squad, but it was only a matter of time before the pressure of being perfect was going to get to her. During the summer of 1996, Heather began dating a boy by the name of Randy Wood. To give a little background about Randy, he was born on July 7th of 1979. Growing up, Randy's living situation was unstable. He and his single mother moved around a lot, and in 5th grade alone, he attended 3 different schools. When they finally settled down in Waurika, they were known as one of the poorest families in the town. Their home was visibly unappealing, with a bunch of broken windows. Randy himself was seen as a big, dumb kid and a little slow, and every day he walked about a mile to school. But despite his problems, his demeanor overall was very calm and polite, and people liked him. He was even made the captain of Waurika High School's football team. And in a weird way, Heather herself was really attracted to Randy's so-called deficiencies. She liked him and he liked her. And during their time together in early to late 1996, they found solace in each other's company. The two of them drove around all the time in Randy's grandma's car, they attended church, and talked for hours on end. And although their relationship was intimate, they never actually hooked up. But as it sometimes happens, Heather and Randy's romance ended as a result of outside influences. At some point near the beginning of the school year, Randy overheard a rumor that Heather had been skinny dipping at a party. After that, he broke up with her, and thus came the end of their 5-month-long relationship. Following this, Heather slipped into a downward spiral. Unfortunately, the outside influences and distractions she was surrounded by started working against her best interests. Now, because Waurika was an extremely small town, there was very little to do. Therefore, teens often resorted to not only substance abuse, but radical and dangerous behavior overall. And Heather was no different. Soon, she began experimenting with methamphetamine, alcohol, and then, less than a week after her breakup with Randy, one of Heather's acquaintances suddenly passed away. His name was Dennis, and at only 20 years old, he died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Afterwards, Heather continued acting out and partying. On September 27th of 1996, she was caught drinking alcohol with a friend on the sidelines of a football game. As a result, Heather was given a 3-day suspension from school and nearly kicked off of the cheerleading squad. Understandably, her parents, Gail and Dwayne, were concerned about their daughter's recent behavior. In order to try and turn things around, they scheduled her for an appointment to see a therapist on October 3rd. But unfortunately, that would never end up taking place. During the night of October 2nd of 1996, Heather and her mother Gail had a big argument over a $300 phone bill Heather racked up. Gail demanded an answer from her daughter as to how she was going to pay for this. "All you ever do is cost me money," Gail shouted. In response, Heather didn't really have a good answer, but continued arguing nonetheless. Then, later that night, when Heather's parents went to bed, she wished her father a good night while ignoring her mother. And unbeknownst to the two of them, that was going to be the last time they ever saw their daughter alive. Around midnight, Heather snuck out of the house through her bedroom window and met up with a boy by the name of Josh Bagwell. Heather and Josh had been flirting a bit since her breakup with Randy, and this late-night meetup was supposed to be their first date. Josh was a senior at Waurika High and a member of one of the wealthiest families in town. According to those that knew him, he was a stereotypical spoiled rich kid. He lived with his grandparents, and they gave him practically everything he wanted. Josh had no understanding of the word discipline. He did whatever he wanted without fear of consequences, even if it meant breaking the law. Evidently, at one point, Josh was pulled over for a DUI. He demanded a lawyer while he was resisting arrest. By the age of 17, he had already gone through a grand total of 6 cars. His latest was a white Dodge Stealth, and he was planning to drive it through town during the school's homecoming parade. Heather found herself drawn to Josh's status, and by flirting with him, she managed to secure her place in his car during the parade. Josh was also friends with Heather's ex, Randy, and they were all a part of the same friend group. But despite Heather sneaking out to hang out with Josh, he was going to be sending out other invites as well, including some people who would make her worst nightmares come true. On the morning of October 3rd of 1996, Heather's parents, Gail and Dwayne, woke up to find their daughter missing from her room. Soon after, they tried reporting her missing to the police, but the police didn't accept it because she hadn't been gone for long enough. They said she had probably just ran away and it was best to wait. In response, Dwayne and Gail tried to argue that there was no way that their daughter would have ran away because she had left all of her belongings behind. Had she ran away, she would have needed to bring some stuff with her. Regardless, the police wouldn't budge, so Heather's parents were forced to go looking themselves. Gail, who led the charge, began making inquiries all around town. Immediately, she suspected that people who were associated with Heather would have some knowledge on where she went. Therefore, she went up to Waurika High and acquired a list of people who were absent on the morning Heather snuck out. This list included 2 suspicious names, Randy Wood and Josh Bagwell. Upon learning this, Gail first called Randy to see what he knew. Randy told Gail he knew nothing about Heather's whereabouts. He said he had been hanging out with Josh Bagwell all morning and hadn't seen Heather at all. But Gail found Randy's emotionless tone of voice to be suspicious. She felt like he knew a lot more than he was letting on. Now Gail and Dwayne met up with Josh Bagwell in person to see what he knew about Heather's disappearance. Josh told the two of them that he hadn't seen Heather in a week. He claimed he didn't know where she had gone. And well, that was that. They weren't able to get anything else out of him. So out of last resort, Heather's parents ultimately decided on hiring a private investigator. The investigator scoured a large stretch of wooded area around Waurika, but never ended up finding anything. Then, only a week after Heather's disappearance, a Texas rancher was walking near some woods when he spotted a leg sticking out from the bottom of a murky creek. At first, he thought that it was a dead calf that had floated upstream, so he shot it with his rifle and returned home. But the next day, after a closer examination, he eventually realized it was a human body. Immediately, he then called the police. Upon arrival, the police were unable to identify the body due to its extreme condition. However, they could make a few assumptions. One, the creek was near a concrete bridge, so an assumption could be made that the body was thrown off of the bridge. Two, there appeared to be an effort by the perpetrator to cover up their tracks using dirt. And three, the body had clearly been shot multiple times. So yeah, some of these clues would be very helpful later on. But given the fact that police knew a teen girl had gone missing only 40 miles away, they figured that it would be smart to contact the girl's parents. This evening, Dwayne Rich arrived at the site of the creek to identify whether or not it was Heather. Dwayne wasn't allowed to actually see her body, but he identified her through a ring that police found on her finger. Later that night, he then returned home and broke the news to his wife, Gail. Heather, their only daughter, had been found dead in a creek in Texas. Immediately, Gail broke down crying and began pounding her fists. She couldn't understand why this had happened. It wasn't fair. From that point forward, both of Heather's parents became dedicated to tracking down whoever had done this. No matter what it took, they were going to get justice for Heather. In the meantime, however, they had to prepare for a funeral they never anticipated could have happened. Heather's funeral took place on October 14th of 1996. The location was at a church in Comanche, Oklahoma. As people went up to pay their condolences and say goodbye to her, nobody was allowed to touch her casket. The reason for this was because Gail suspected that the individual or persons responsible for her death was somebody that Heather knew. Therefore, Gail had promised that whoever had done this would, quote unquote, never touch her again. But following the discovery of Heather's body, police had officially began an investigation into her murder. The investigation team included members of the local Texas and Oklahoma police departments, along with the FBI. Their makeshift headquarters was in a train depot in Waurika called the Rock Island Depot. During the next week, they conducted over 100 interviews with various people throughout Waurika. However, they made very little progress. This was partly because Waurika had a very specific party culture where snitching was a big no-no. So when investigators interviewed all of the teenagers who could have provided them leads, few of them cooperated. Before long, the investigative team interviewed Heather's mom, Gail, and she told them her suspicions about the two boys she thought may have been responsible. Additionally, some of the girls on the cheerleading squad brought up the same two names. Those were, of course, none other than Josh Bagwell and Randy Wood. The cheerleaders described Josh as being the snobby rich kid in town, while Randy was friendly and well-liked. In fact, so well-liked by this point, he had been made homecoming king. According to the cheerleaders, Heather had gone to a party at Josh's the night of her disappearance. But when authorities interviewed Josh and Randy, they were unable to pry any useful info out of them. Each denied seeing Heather at Josh's party, just as they had denied seeing her to her own parents. According to Josh and Randy, they spent the night of October 2nd playing dominoes and drinking whiskey in the trailer behind Josh's home. But the officer talking to Josh and Randy found their body language and some of the cryptic things they were saying to be suspicious. So they kept a note of it and moved on for the time being. Then, after talking to Josh and Randy, the investigation took an interesting turn. One lead that detectives received led them in the direction of a local dealer. The suspicion was that Heather may have been involved in some sort of deal gone wrong. But yet again, that lead came up short. The dealer came up with an alibi, and the alibi proved to be legitimate. So next, the focus returned to the party Heather snuck out to go to on the night of October 2nd. Now back to the drawing board, the detectives in Heather's case re-examined some details about her body. It was confirmed that she was shot 9 times with a shotgun. So first, the question that arose was, why was she shot so many times? The second was, where did the ammunition come from? If they could find this second part out, it would lead them in the right direction. Soon, the investigators' team began to interview the owners and clerks of different gun stores around town. Because the detectives knew exactly what type of ammunition was used, they requested to see if anyone had bought that type within the past several weeks. One of the stores they went to was called Beaver Creek Lumber and Hardware. It was located in Waurika and owned by the Beaver family. Upon interviewing one of the owners, she admitted to selling Josh Bagwell and a friend of his named Curtis 4 boxes of the same ammunition used in Heather's murder. But who was this Curtis? Well, as it turns out, Curtis Gamble was a 19-year-old high school dropout and another member of Josh's friend group. Curtis lived several miles away in Texas, but frequented the area a lot. He was described by people that met him as nothing less than evil. Growing up, Curtis cycled through many different youth detention centers and was known to shoot people's dogs in their own front yards. Additionally, he had been arrested many times before and was on police's radar. Naturally, because of their dark natures, Josh and Curtis became friends quite easily. They both shared an interest in hunting, camping, and fishing. And to anyone that knew them, it was really only a question of when, not if, this dangerous duo would get into some serious trouble. So after the team investigating Heather finished interviewing the owner of Beaver Hardware store, they set their sights on Josh and Curtis. During the evening of October 24th, police entered Josh Bagwell's home and arrested him. At the time, he was sleeping, and when they arrived, they unexpectedly woke him up. Evidently, he was surrounded by a bunch of weapons at the time, including 2 swords and a couple of rifles. One of the officers had thought that Rich's murder had caused him insomnia, to which Josh replied, "You just woke me up. Did it look like I was having trouble sleeping?" After being arrested, Josh then exercised his Fifth Amendment right to silence and refused to perform a polygraph test. Meanwhile, police also visited Curtis's house. At Curtis's house, they talked to both him and his grandmother, Rita. During her interview, Rita described a moment in Curtis's childhood that immediately caused the authorities' ears to peak up. She said that a long time ago, she used to take him fishing at Belknap Creek Bridge. As it turns out, this was the exact same bridge near where Heather's body was found. So after talking to Curtis himself, Curtis agreed to a polygraph test and to answer some questions at the police station. First, he failed the polygraph, then they moved on to questioning. Initially, Curtis played dumb And when authorities confronted him with the forensic evidence, including the shotgun and ammunition, he claimed they were for hunting and that he could prove it. Afterwards, FBI agents were sent out to look for used shotgun shells and stuff in some rural pastures. But this led nowhere. So despite initially playing dumb, police confronted him. And following 8 hours of interrogation, Curtis finally confessed, but did so in a way that laid a lot of the blame on others. Meanwhile, the third perpetrator in the crime had also been arrested. His name was none other than Randy Wood, Heather's ex-boyfriend. Despite never having a criminal record and being a generally polite guy, Randy had in fact played a role in her murder. Also, he was the only one among the 3 perpetrators to pass a polygraph test. Randy's depiction of events is believed to be the most consistent with the evidence, so here's what he claims to have taken place. On the evening of October 2nd of 1996, Randy, Josh, and Curtis were all hanging out like they would have done any other weekend. As midnight approached, Josh was supposed to pick up Heather from a church near her house. But after driving there with the others, they saw that she was no longer there. So instead, Josh and friends drove to her home, snuck up to her window, and knocked. After they didn't receive a response, they drove back to Josh's house. And as it turned out, Heather had beat them there. She was waiting on the steps of a trailer parked outside the home. For a short while after that, all 4 of the teens hung out in the trailer, drinking and listening to the radio. But before long, Heather and Josh started kissing and requested some alone time. So then Randy and Curtis left and drove to some back roads. Meanwhile, over the next hour, Heather became increasingly more intoxicated inside the trailer with Josh. By the time Randy and Curtis returned to Josh's trailer, Heather was extremely drunk. Evidently, Josh and Heather had and Heather became really apologetic towards Randy about it. Heather had begun saying how sorry she was to him and how bad she felt. But Randy reassured her by telling her it was okay. The 2 of them had broken up a while back. It wasn't like she was cheating on him or anything. And then eventually, Heather just passed out in the trailer. After that happened, the boys encouraged each other to take advantage of her. Once they all did so in one way or another, they left the trailer for a bit. At some point, though, Heather woke up and began screaming. As a result, Curtis began freaking out and was concerned that Heather was going to accuse him of. From that moment onward, he started talking about killing her, and before long, the half-baked plan commenced. Curtis got out his shotgun and essentially demanded the others do what he said. Together, Josh and Randy carried Heather into the back of Josh's pickup truck, and Josh began driving in the direction of Texas. Eventually, Curtis got frustrated at Josh's driving and took the wheel himself. Upon doing so, he drove to a place near his home known as Belknap Creek Bridge. After parking, Curtis once again demanded that Randy and Josh relocate Heather. This time, he told them to pick her up and bring her to the edge of the bridge. After they did so, Randy returned to his truck and covered his face with his hands. Meanwhile, from the top of the bridge, Curtis shot Heather multiple times with the shotgun. And finally, the boys all helped to throw her body into the creek below, and thus came the end of a poor girl's life. During the next few weeks, they all tried their best to stick to their stories and play dumb. But we all know that only works for so long. So after being arrested in the early hours of October 24th, all 3 of them were officially charged with first-degree murder. Then following their respective trials in 1997 to 1998, Josh Bagwell, Curtis Gamble, and Randy Wood were each sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole. A few years after these sentences were given, however, something unexpected happened. In 2002, while Curtis was being put on trial for another charge related to the crime, Both he and Josh Bagwell were temporarily relocated to a jail in Texas. During their stay there, they successfully worked together with a couple of other inmates to break out of jail. For the next 9 days, Josh and Curtis then evaded capture before ultimately getting into a standoff with police outside of a convenience store. Somehow, they had even acquired a handgun during their escape, but in the end, they surrendered to authorities. The following month, yet another strange thing occurred when Josh's mother, Therese, attempted to help him and Curtis escape from jail again. Her plan was to get into contact with Curtis's brother Rick and to sneak in a bunch of weapons to Josh by acting as Josh's lawyer. Additionally, she wanted Rick to help her gather some firearms, maps, and cell phones to give to the two felons once they escaped again. But once she actually contacted him, Curtis's brother informed the police. And following a period of police surveillance, Therese herself was arrested and sentenced to 20 years in prison, 12 of which was deferred. Another thing to add to this is a very bizarre occurrence that we briefly mentioned earlier. Heather had a friend named Dennis Wayne Goss Jr., who was 20 years old and allegedly took himself out with a shotgun on September 25th of 1996, or 1 week before Heather was murdered. Now, Dennis was actually good friends with Curtis Gamble. They hung out quite a lot. Dennis's cause of death was changed from to unknown after his father, Dennis Sr., told the police that his son told him that someone was trying to kill him, though Dennis never said who. After Curtis and Josh escaped from prison, they went to Dennis's father's home and stole a .22 caliber pistol and a truck. Curtis had known exactly where the keys were to unlock the safe. Also, Dennis's family was put on a threat list that Curtis wrote while he was in jail. As to what actually happened to Dennis, it's unknown, as this case is still considered to be open. Anyway, that was the end of that. Now, as you probably could have guessed, this case attracted a lot of media attention during the time. But at its core, it's not just some headline. It's a genuinely sad, heartbreaking story about a girl whose life was taken way too soon. Heather was known for having a very energetic and high-spirited personality. She was a bright soul who had an impressive impact on those around her. It's a complete and utter shame that she died in the way that she did, but all we can do now is keep her memory alive to continue to let the world know that she existed. On the guardrail of Belknap Creek Bridge sits the words, "Gone, not forgotten. Rest in peace, Heather, 1996. And maybe it's appropriate that this message is written in graffiti because that's the people's language, and after all, Heather was very popular with the people. But anyways, thank you for watching this episode of High Time Crime. If true crime is your thing, then please like and subscribe because it's all we do. I also have an all-exclusive Patreon if you're interested in that. There's a bunch of tiers to choose from, and the third one allows for you to see a Patreon-only video, and that tier and the second one allow you to have your name at the end of each High Time Crime video. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care, friend.